Welcome back, ladies, gentlemen, and all else to another video. Finally, I've been able to set aside some time from my quite busy schedule to make a new one. Today, we are going back in time to review quite a classic creepypasta. Older viewers of mine will remember this one. Today, we are venturing into the enchanting world of Tamriel, as we take a look at the Morrowind-themed creepypasta Jvk1166z.esp. This one certainly brings me back. Do you guys remember way back in 2014 when I featured this one in my top 13 video game creepypastas video? What a wild ride it's been since then.
Jvk1166z.esp.
I want to take a look back at this particular story because I remember liking it quite a bit back in the day. I was feeling a bit nostalgic today is all. Now, the earliest mentions of this story that I was able to dig up through my research come from 2011, which is when I believe this story was written. More than 10 years ago, which makes me feel kinda weird. This means that this story was one of the first video game pastas of its time. This means that the story also came out the same year as Skyrim originally did. What is time even? This story is all about a strange, mysterious mod for the 2002 role-playing game Morrowind, which was for the time period a quite unique angle to base a video game creepypasta on, keyword being at the time, since the creepypasta genre was still quite young at that point. It hadn't even really exploded in the way it was about to a few years later, around I wanna say 2014 or so. The initial setup here is quite good. Bethesda modding is super popular after all, and makes the longevity of their games extend years and years after their initial releases. People are still making Skyrim mods, they're making Fallout mods, and so on, even a decade after some of these games were initially released. It is super impressive how modders have been able to modernize these games and keep the community alive for so long. I highly respect it. There are thousands of mods out there for these games, so it would be no surprise to find out that some include rather dark material, and that is what this story is all about. Let's start by describing what happens in it, and then I'm gonna give my thoughts on the story. If you want to read the full thing for yourself, which I highly recommend to get the full experience, then go down into the description to find a link to it. Jvk1166z.esp, which I will call JVK moving forward to make things easier, begins innocently enough by discussing a rather obscure, strange Morrowind mod called, well, the title of the story which I've already mentioned numerous times. In what I think is a smart move, the writer of the story assumes that some readers may already be aware of the mod, while introducing it to the reader as it allegedly caused a bit of buzz when it first released. This small detail helps add legitimacy to the story, and it is a detail that I personally appreciate. It makes it seem as though this mod may have actually existed at one point. The mod was only up for a few days, and only posted on smaller forums and fan groups, and for a select few, sent through DMs or email. What seemed to at first be a virus was quickly forgotten about, as no one could quite figure out what the mod was attempting to do or say. It did nothing but freeze your game and then crash it while corrupting your install of Morrowind in the process, so it's no surprise most people stayed away. Around a year later though, someone began to share the mod again in a mod board the author used to visit often. Apparently, a lurker on the board had sent the mod to another user before quickly deleting their account immediately after, but not before advising people to play the game with the mod enabled through DOSBox. This way, the aforementioned problems with the game crashing would cease, and one could actually play the game, though not without issues of lag and certain options and mechanics not working. It seemed to be a complete overhaul of the game. What one would first notice when starting a new game with JVK enabled was that every NPC involved with the main quest of the game would be dead, all except for Yagrum Bagarn. Each NPC's corpse could be found in the world. Immediately, however, the world seemed doomed to begin with. Secondly, your player character would constantly be losing health, slowly but surely, making one have to heal often. If one stayed in one spot for too long, health would drop even faster. If one died, something quite peculiar would happen, and this is where things get interesting. A figure the mod board that discussed their findings with the mod came to refer to as the Assassin, dressed in completely black, untextured Dark Brotherhood armor, crawled on his hands and feet, legs spread out like a spider, to the dead body of the player character, crawling all over their body just before one reloaded their save. Sometimes, one could also catch glimpses of this strange character hurrying around corners or crawling on walls or ceilings, always seeming to be watching the main character. Other than that, the only other big differences in the game was that during nighttime, randomly, each NPC in the game would go outside for a couple of minutes and do nothing but repeat the phrase, "Watch the sky," when talked to. Once this routine was over with each night, they would return to normal. In the temple at Ghostgate, a new male Dunmer NPC named Tierras could be found with a unique robe, rendered with twinkling stars all across it. The character was also voice acted, quite surprisingly, seeming to be voiced with the default male Dunmer voice, or at the very least a very good imitation of it. This NPC would send you to a dungeon named the Citadel, located on a small island to the west of Morrowind. This dungeon proved to be massive, filled with Daedric and Dwemer ruins and extremely difficult enemies to fight. Many, including the author, would give up at this point in the mod, as one could not use console commands in JVK to level up faster or kill these hardened enemies. However, what the author proceeds to detail next are the accounts of the few players who actually managed to get further into this mysterious dungeon. If one persisted, one would find themselves deeper inside the Dwemer ruins of before, yet these tombs would be darker and filled with steam and fog all around your character. All surfaces, including the enemies, were black, making it difficult to make out anything that wasn't immediately in front of the player, and if one somehow made it past this section of the dungeon, you would reach a hall which players would come to refer to as the Portrait Room. Inside this room, picture frames that would always face directly at you were found. These frames would include images that would be randomly picked from one's My Pictures folder, which might have been quite startling for some. At the end of this room, one would find a locked door with seemingly no way of opening it. Returning to Tierras, the aforementioned new NPC, the man would now say nothing more than, "Watch the sky." Every other NPC in the game would from now on be stripped of dialogue as well, saying nothing whenever one attempted to speak to them, except for at night, when the "Watch the sky" routine kept repeating. Once one did view the sky from this point forward, the sky would have changed from that of Tamriel to that of our real-world night sky, and it moved. From this point on in the story, all events reported were based on the experiences of one player from the mod board, who figured out based on the constellations and planets in the sky that it started sometime around February of 2005. The author kept up contact with this user who relayed his experiences with the mod from this point forward. If the player died, reloaded, or returned to the Citadel, the sky would start over, and during the day, the sky's movement would pause until night set in again. One night in the game would move around 2 months of the stars in the sky, equivalent to the real world. One day-night cycle in JVK would roughly amount to a little less than an hour. The one player left playing the mod was convinced that the locked door from the portrait room would open during some sort of celestial event. So, through sheer determination and by dodging the assassin, they played the game for a whole day to see if anything new would occur. 24 hours in, the assassin did something completely unexpected. It crouched down right in front of the main character and shrieked, before running off, which startled the player. Yet, no change occurred in the portrait room. The player would try again, this time waiting 3 days instead of 1. The assassin would keep shrieking, and if the player remained still for a few seconds after this, they would be hit by them. 3 days passed, and the assassin shrieked once more. Looking around, the player discovered every NPC in the town of Seydanin outside, all repeating, "Watch the sky," as the game slowly became increasingly dark, to the point where you could hardly make anything out. The player could, however, make out small figures in the distance, running back and forth, and running off if one got too close, always just out of sight. Once the player began swimming towards the Citadel dungeon, several other characters began swimming all around the player in the dark. However, once reaching the portrait room again, the door remained shut and sadly, the sky reset once more, causing the player to give up out of frustration. Other players who made it to the portrait room claimed the assassin began appearing in their regular unmodded Morrowind games, sometimes crawling towards them or waiting around corners before darting off. The player who had attempted to beat the mod and who had kept up contact with the author soon began acting abusively and increasingly short-tempered on the mod board, and was soon kicked from the board for their behavior. Weeks later, the author sent the player an email to make sure things were alright. The player answered. They had started up JVK again, having apparently made it all the way to where the sky now displayed the sky of 2011. Sleep deprived and clearly disturbed, the player detailed how the game remained dark as ever, and that each NPC in Seyda had moved, settling in a small bandit cave, refusing to say anything and refusing to fight back when attacked by the player character. All towns and cities were deserted, with every NPC hiding in caves, tombs, or sewers. Once the player reached the sky of 2014, the screen was fully dark. All one could see were the brightest stars in the sky. NPCs remained quiet, yet when the player walked up to them and used a light spell to see them more clearly, their eyes had started bleeding. Once almost reaching 2015 in the sky, the player became frustrated as the planets above them were not moving right. All monsters in the world were gone, yet the corpses of the main quest characters were still around. The player did not need headphones any longer. Whenever the assassin shrieked, it was as if they were screaming straight into their ear. The assassin appeared a lot more often, a lot closer than before, and the strange figures running around in the distance were still there, but barely noticeable. The player's paranoia in real life increased as well, as whenever they went to the bathroom or around their house, they swore they could see something in the corner of their eye. The last update the player ever gave to the author began with them describing a terrible nightmare. The assassin was there, shrieking, and when the player woke up, the assassin stood right there by their bed, crouching over him with longer arms and legs, not unlike a spider. Trying to push the creature away proved impossible, as it simply absorbed the hands of the player as if it were made of tar. Then, the player woke up. At least, they thought they did. When looking at their monitor, they were in the Corpusarium with Yagrum. Darkness was gone, and the light was back, finally. Once the player sat down at their computer, Yagrum began speaking to them in Tierez's voice. The character knew things about the player, things they had never told anyone else, or even forgotten about. Yagrum then assured the player that almost no one had made it this far. Soon, the door would open. They just had to hold out a little longer. He said that the player would know when it was time, and that they might be the first one to see what was inside. Then, they woke up for real. Still at their computer, now swimming out to the Citadel island, they could hear this tapping on their window, like he was knocking his finger on the glass. Perhaps the player was still dreaming. That is how the final message the player sent the author ended. The story then ends shortly thereafter, as the author knows that there are a few other stories regarding the mod out there by other users, though this is the one that they know is true as far as they know. The author deleted their copy of the JVK mod after initially giving up. However, they would love to try their hand at the mod again sometime, and urges anyone who may still have a copy of the file to share it with them. They would love to see some of this mod for themselves. That right there was Jvk1166z.esp. What at first felt like quite an abrupt ending to me, I now appreciate, since I'm glad the story didn't drag things out or reveal or explain too much. We don't need to know what is behind that locked door, and nor do we need to know if the player was actually visited by this terrifying assassin in real life, or if they were simply imagining things after going days without sleep. In the case of this story, I feel the questions asked by the end of it are really interesting, and I am glad that the story was concise and once again didn't explain too much to the point where it ruined the mystery. That makes things all the more scary. You're literally left in the dark wondering what could have been behind that door. Was the mod created by the user who quickly deleted their account afterwards, or was it perhaps only passed on to pass the curse further? It is quite mysterious, and one wonders just what the mod may have been trying to say. It causes one to stop and think. Why did each NPC want you to watch the sky? How did Yagrum possess such knowledge? How did the game display our real life's night sky? I guess we will never find out. I think it's a smart decision to make it so that most of the experiences with the mod come from secondhand accounts and not the experiences of the actual author. This only adds to the cryptic nature of the mod and makes you wonder just what it was actually like, if the players were exaggerating or actually going through what they said they were. It helps avoid some of the melodrama that many video game creepypastas can go through when the author is relaying what is going on firsthand. I also find the concept of the mod weeding out the players that aren't dedicated enough to be well done. The further into the story you get, the fewer the players detail their experiences, to the point where only one user on the mod board seems to be left. It makes you feel as though the further in you get in the mod, the more isolated and alone you become, coupled with the NPCs turning quiet and every monster disappearing from the world. You start to wonder if the world of Morrowind is coming to an end, as every town and city becomes deserted and everyone begins acting frantically. It quickly becomes very desolate. It is as if the end times are near, and one wonders if the real-life Sky present in the game is trying to tell us something about our own future. After all, the planets weren't moving right. Seeing as how the story was written in 2011, the fact that the player made it all the way to 2015 in the sky, which was the future at that point, makes one wonder if somewhere in our near future, something terrible will happen to our world, just as terrible things begin happening in the world of Morrowind. Perhaps that is what the mod was trying to warn people about. The player got so close to finding out what was behind that door. I think the story details just how frantic, paranoid, and sleep-deprived this final player became quite well. It is no stretch to imagine the user becoming completely obsessed with seeing things through to the end, due to the negative influence the mod and the assassin was having on his mind, whether this was self-imposed or possibly supernatural. You can tell that the author knows a little bit about what they were talking about when it comes to the Elder Scrolls modding community and the fan culture surrounding it. It feels like something genuine that could have happened on any fan forum. It is very well written in my eyes and makes one feel as though what is going on is legit, with various references to the different mechanics of Morrowind and so on, such as a mention of the Scroll of Icarian Flight. Some in the comments, however, have brought up the fact that Morrowind apparently doesn't run through DOSBox, which I felt was worth mentioning. That might bring some people out of the story and ruin their immersion. For me, I'm able to look past that for the sake of the story. I would say the writing is strong. It's not overly superfluous or particularly melodramatic, even when things ramp up. It feels realistic and grounded for the most part, and describes just enough for you to get an idea of what the author is going for. It is often quite subtle, and nowhere in the story is it needlessly gratuitous just for the sake of it. I really enjoy the build-up the story does. Things start out fairly mundane, but slowly but surely devolve into panic, paranoia, and doom. I think it's really well done. The final message the player sends the author is a particular highlight. For some, this moment might be too much, it might be too unrealistic and too far. I would understand if one felt that way, since the rest of the story had kept things somewhat low-key up to that point. Personally though, I like the ending quite a bit, and I think it contributes a lot towards making the story memorable and rather chilling. Imagining this tall, shrieking assassin standing by your bed watching you as you wake up is not fun. The story does just enough in this regard to keep you guessing, and without this section, I don't think the story would have become nearly as popular as it became, so I feel that it was necessary. It didn't subtract from what came before. As I mentioned before, this story was written all the way back in 2011, so some of the more usual creepypasta occurrences one finds in this story, such as the bleeding eyes or the dead NPCs or whatnot, I feel can be excused, as this story was one of the first of its kind, and one of the best at it, all things considered. It does a lot in a relatively short amount of time, and I personally consider it to be a great story. It is a classic for a reason, and the story definitely resonated with people to the point where some are even recreating the mod in Morrowind. The story definitely takes some liberties when it comes to what can and can't be done in video games, and for some that may be too distracting. Some may find the ending a bit too much, and I wouldn't blame anyone for feeling that way. However, I have a positive view of the story. It is one of my favorite video game creepypastas in the genre, and I feel it works well for what it sets out to do. It capitalizes on the cultures of internet forums, modding communities, and horror stories that are shared around, and I think it works out quite well for what it is. I think the story still holds up well 13 years later, and I am glad that I decided to reread it for this video. I hope you enjoyed going through it with me as well. I believe that is all I have to say about Jvk1166z.esp for now. Thank you so much for checking this video out. I do apologize for not uploading as much at all in recent years. I guess you could say I'm growing up in a sense. I have a job now outside of YouTube that I need to prioritize to pay the bills. Therefore, whenever I do get time off, I want to spend it relaxing or spending time with friends and family. Therefore, video making sort of falls by the wayside once in a while, so while I will do my best to keep making videos when I have the time and energy for you guys, please understand that I do need to keep my sanity as well. We good? Thank you. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more videos like it, then make sure you leave a like and comment your thoughts down below. Check out my social medias if you'd like, or my Patreon page to support the channel directly. Thanks for watching, everyone. Your support even now through all these years really does mean a lot to me, so thank you. Stay awesome. Goodbye.